Welcome to Into the Words, a podcast at the Highlights Foundation. Today in the cabin, we have Carron. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you for having me, Allison.
So Christine has been with us many times here at the Highlights Foundation, and this morning we were having a wonderful conversation off the podcast about critiques, giving them, receiving them. And so I'm thrilled that you've decided to come on down to the cabin and share some of these insights with our listeners. One of the great things that we spent time talking about this morning was the idea that questioning becomes the core belief of a good critique. Can you expand on that for a little bit? What do you mean by questioning when it comes to critiques?
I think you can approach that on two levels. One, it's always helpful when you're giving critiques a writer instead of making pronouncements, especially if you're reviewing an excerpt, which in most critiques you're reviewing a few pages, a few chapters. So you might not know the whole vision for that writer. So instead of making a pronouncement, I think this should be or that should be, just ask what were you trying to achieve here? What was the goal with this? Is this setting something up? Because for me as a reader that was distracting, but maybe that's a really important seeding of something that's coming. So just asking questions and giving responses as a reader. But I also think, more importantly, as a reviewer of someone's creative work, you have to make a decision within yourself of what task are you giving yourself as a reviewer, or what question are you answering. And there is a style of giving critiques which, from looking from the outside in at it, it seems like the question the reviewer is asking, or the task they have given themselves, is how do I tell this writer everything that's wrong about their novel, in my opinion, in as much detail as possible? Where, from my perspective, the questions I ask myself and the tasks that I give myself is A, how do I help this writer write the novel they want to write? Mm-hmm. And that means there has to be an imagination shift, and that's a wonderful thing because we're writers and we deal in imagination. So how do I make an imagination shift that I'm not writing this person's story? It's not about how I would craft this, how I would set it up, the pacing that I would do, but imagine based on, even if I only know a little bit, get a sense of their writing, what they're trying to achieve, and help them write that story. And the other question I ask myself is, how do I help this person grow and thrive as a writer? Mm-hmm. Because when I've been given critiques that I have a sense that I'm being seen as a writer, my story is being seen as a story that I want to tell, there's something so touching and motivating and inspiring about that I just, even if I have 50,000 things to fix, I'm like, okay, but there's value has been seen in this. Value has been seen in my effort. Let me make it better. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think when I talk about questioning, it's what question or what task are you giving yourself as a reviewer?
Yeah, and I love that idea too. I think that's something going into giving critique, that power dynamic then too. So when you're saying you want to help someone write the novel that they want to write, it's giving over some of that power. And I wonder, as far as critiques are concerned, if we could talk a little bit about those power dynamics, because there is power in the person giving the feedback, but there's also power in the person receiving the feedback, yes, which is something important to keep in mind.
And when I work with people also in the corporate world on giving and receiving feedback and working with groups, and I'm very precise in what skill set are we talking about. Are we talking about the skill set of giving feedback or receiving feedback? And there's different conversations that have to happen around both. if someone's interested in growing in those skill sets. And in the context of receiving feedback, the bottom line is it's a much more vulnerable position. You're especially as a creative person, as an artist, where probably some of your own vulnerabilities are going on the page if you're trying to get a potent scene written that's maybe close to your heart or close to the bone. So it's more vulnerable, and that's awesome because you want to be vulnerable in your writing. You want to move yourself and you want to move your readers. But there has to be almost a slight energetic shift when you're receiving feedback, and there has to be a balance of vulnerability that allows you to receive and hear what someone is offering you. And you have to take care of that. You just can't toss that out and say, I hope Allison is really, kind of nice to me when this, that's your responsibility to manage your vulnerability and to do what that takes. If that's listening to mantras before you go in there, if it's, that right after you get a critique, you have to go get a coffee before you go home to your family, your children, your dogs, whatever it is, you're taking care of your vulnerability. But the thing that many, many people forget, and I certainly did when I was starting out writing, is that you're still the author. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but you could ignore everything that anybody says to you. That's the extreme. But what's helpful in just taking in the feedback, listening to the feedback initially before you as the author decide how you're going to sort it, parse it, decide what you're going to respond to, how you're going to respond to it. Just keeping like this little thought in the back of your mind, I'm the author.
Right.
I can hear all of this. Allison saying XYZ about my novel does not mean I have to do it. So this balance of power, like owning your authorial power and also managing your vulnerability, that it's going to help you be more resilient.
Right.
And well, there's a word I want to use, but I don't know if it will get cut out. But you want to be awesome at receiving feedback. That's what I'm going to say. You want to be totally awesome at receiving feedback, because the more awesome you can get at receiving feedback, the more likely people are going to feel excited and safe giving you feedback, because you're not going to have a reaction and you're going to get better data. You're going to get better data to make your story better, to make yourself a better writer.
Yeah.
So figure this one out is what I tell to people. Do what you need to do. And it's not easy. This notion people say, just don't take it personally. Well, there's practical things you can do to not take it personally. And what I would say is take it personally, but be able to handle that hit. Be resilient. Be awesome at receiving feedback.
That's great. Yeah, it makes
you can tell I get a little passionate about this.
No, I love that. Yeah. That's something that's taken me, a decade to kind of get to a point where I have a system in place that I tend to get, at the end, after I've done so many revisions, I have trusted whole novel readers. And so when they send feedback, I journal. I use the term suggestions on the left-hand side and how I feel on the right-hand side.
Right.
And so I write the suggestion down and I write how I feel. It helps me get some of that prioritizing in place too, because when I read something on the left-hand side that says, XYZ, on the right-hand side, if I say, this is awesome, this is exactly what I want to do, I can tackle that first and feel so successful, so you're right. There are these really practical tips to kind of help us have that power when it comes to critique. And I think that's why you've started the Critique MD, to give people back some of that power. So I do want to shift just a little bit. I could talk to you forever about critique. It's so important. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this new program that you have, the Critique MD. Where did this idea come from? What has it grown to? How do we get connected with you?
So thank you. And so it's brand new. I just officially launched the Critique MD, where critique skills go to get better. So I'm from a medical family. Being the Critique MD is the only way MD is going to be any way associated with my name. I'm a little bit, sometimes I think I was switched at birth, that I ended up in a medical family. So this is some fun that I come from a family of doctors and nurses. It also leverages my corporate background in working with people. But I've been pursuing writing and growing as a writer for 10 years and was immediately thrown into critique groups. And even with my corporate background, giving classes on giving and receiving feedback, as a critique giver, I was like, you've got to be kidding. You want me to tell someone what's wrong with, I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with my book. So I kind of was like, what? I'm supposed to be telling people how to fix their novel? And then from the idea of receiving feedback, it helped that I had some training, but in the first blog post that I've posted, I talk about in the corporate world, there's at least a veneer of we're going to be professional and left-brained and, no big feelings. Even though they want everybody to be creative in the corporate world, we won't talk about that kind of mismatch. But when we're talking about someone's writing, what I said earlier is true. You want to move people. Mm-hmm. I think even with nonfiction, you want to move someone. You want to connect. You want an emotive connection. You want the potency. And that means you are coming out on the page. And that's vulnerable. And I have just seen people almost taken down a little bit. And it's not, we can say, okay, there's a responsibility of the feedback giver, but sometimes I'm observed that the feedback giver has actually been neutral to kind, but because the person is so in their vulnerability and so not almost managing themselves, that they get tanked in a way that they can't hear something that is super, super helpful, or they get led off track by following a suggestion that is not relevant to the story that they want to write. It's a valid feedback point, but it's for a story that person probably doesn't want to be the author of. And someone's taking their idea and thinking it could go this way. So because of that, I thought, well, I've always wanted to work with writers and come up with a way to help writers. And this seemed so specific and so focused and a nice connection point between leveraging all my corporate world and stuff and frameworks and psychology and approaches and how I work with teams in crisis and how do you basically shift someone or a team, or in this case a writer, to a better state so they can stay in the flow of just churning out their best book of the story they want to tell. And that makes me super happy. So I'm going to, the blog is up with one post. There will be more posts. And the first class will be, the sign up for that will come up soon, and it will be a whole brained approach to critique giving. And just looking from thinking preferences and kind of from is critique giving more left brain, right brain? Is it more cerebral, limbic? And the same for receiving critiques, and then why there's value of making sure you're approaching both skill sets, because again, they're two different skill sets from a holistic perspective, and that will help feedback you're giving land better and put you in a more grounded, empowered state and for receiving feedback. I'm very excited about it.
I think that sounds amazing. So when you look at the idea of giving kind of this skill set or helping to nurture this skill set, are you looking at an individual writer or are you looking at critique groups? Do you think it's beneficial for a group of people who have decided they're going to work together to build up each other's stories to work with you as well.
Yes, so that was interesting that when I originally conceived of this, I was really focused on the individual skill sets of helping people give feedback more effectively, helping people receive feedback more effectively. And then I was at highlights, interesting talking to the wonderful Allison who is sitting across from me, and she goes, "Christine, this would be so useful for critique groups." And then I drove home after our conversation, and I was like, helping groups work together more effectively is actually closer to what I do in the corporate world than anything. So I expanded the offerings of the Critique MD to be of service to critique groups. Because again, there's a certain dynamic. What the bottom line is, and if you can, for anybody who's listening, just get this into your head and be freed up by this notion, is that whenever groups get together, there's going to be conflict. And the way to, and especially if you're talking about people's artistic work and people being vulnerable, then there's the possibility of even more conflict getting stirred up. But that's natural. So you just plan for it. And there are certain things you can do, both from a basic logistics perspective to minimize some of the churn, is what I call it. And then to be prepared when the churn happens, because it's kind of like the season. Sometimes it is going to rain. Sometimes there is going to be a thunderstorm. But that doesn't have to mean like the end of our critique group as we know it. But unfortunately, without some skill set, sometimes that does happen. That critiques group can go way wrong. So that's definitely something that I've added in as support for critique groups and running them.
And so, and just a logistical question here, should people who are interested wait to sign up for a class, or can they reach out to you individually for consultation?
I would say reach out, because this is so new. I'm conceiving of the first classes. I'm going to have a Facebook group. You can certainly respond on the blog or reach me at Christine@thecritiquemd.com. But I'm also happy to shape my services to what listeners and people who want to learn more about this need. Sure. So there's different offerings I'm already conceiving, but if someone has a need and wants to talk to me about, could you help with this? I'm totally excited to talk to you.
Sure. I just want to hit on maybe one or two more things. I'm so enjoying our conversation today. I'm sure the listeners are as well. One of the things, especially here at the Highlights Foundation, that we've been talking so much about, because critique is so emotional, and we do often get the advice, try not to be so emotional about it, or try and put that in perspective. And there really is a difference between receiving feedback on the craft and the structure of your story versus receiving feedback about problematic or sensitive content. And those are different areas. And I think when we look at kind of that craft feedback, when we look at structural feedback, when we're talking maybe about the plot or your character, yes, that is this certain skill set that we have to have where we go back and we really reflect on it. But what about advice for people who, during a critique, something problematic about their story is brought out? And again, I think from the feedback giver, that's done because we care about the readers who will get this story, and we care about getting it right. And so when that information is given to you as the person who wrote the story, regardless of what your intent was when you were writing the story, what is the advice that you have kind of for receiving something like that? Because that will happen to all of us. We will all have something that we didn't notice because of the way that we were raised or because of where we come from, that there could be problematic or sensitive content in the draft.
Absolutely. And I think, to me, everything's a range. And so we spoke a little bit earlier, maybe there are people out there who can enter a critique and just think, oh, got this. People can say whatever they want.
Right.
I'm just down with it. But I think we're a little bit on alert when we're opening up to feedback
Right.
in any context. And it can range. You can probably sense of, is your ego just getting triggered, or is something deeper where it's hitting a core vulnerability, or maybe it feels like a feeling of shame, like, oh, I can't believe I missed that, and I didn't want that perceived that way.
Right.
And you're right, Allison, that we're all going to experience that.
Right.
At some point, if we're committed to writing, we're going to write something that's not going to land in the way we expected, or we weren't aware it could be perceived that way. But for me, it just, again, goes back to the skill set, and especially in receiving this balance of power versus vulnerability. On the point of power, the position I take, no matter how the feedback is delivered, I take the position, this person is trying to help me write the best novel that I can. I honestly don't care if that's true or not. That's the position I'm taking. That's the framework that I'm setting up. So one, if I can hold on to that, that's one anchor. They're trying to help me. They're trying to help me. And then I do my best, if I'm really getting triggered, to say, okay, let me hold it together for this moment. But if I realize I'm really being triggered, we're at highlights right now. How long is it going to take me to get from the barn to the lodge?
Right.
And just say, nobody knock on my door for a little while till I can
Process.
recalibrate myself.
Yeah.
And I think we also have to be generous and gracious to ourselves, as we would be to a dear friend or a child. If we are triggered, if we do have an emotional reaction, we have to allow that too. And then we can say, okay, what went wrong? What was triggered? How could I avoid that the next time? Do I need to listen to more affirmations before I go in? Do I need to just really be, talk myself through like a sports coach? Well, what if this happens? What if they say this? What's the worst case scenario? So I think there's just a sense of grace and a sense of you're on a journey and you're growing. But again, I would just be committed to being awesome at this, to take the hits, to take the emotional learning, to build a support network that you need of trusted writers, other massage therapists, whatever, trusted family members, your dog, if you just need to go cry to your dog,
Right.
whatever your support system is to process this, to get stronger. Because again, the goal is you want to get that story written, you want to get the story written in the best way you can, and you want to get that in context of what I do and what you do in the hands of a child who it will impact.
Well, yeah.
And so I'm willing to take some personal growth hits
Right.
to say, if this helps me write a better story for a child, I'll take it.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Well, I think it's time, unfortunately, for us in the cabin to wrap things up today. But I do want to end with just two things. And one, if you could one more time tell listeners, how do they contact you?
So you can find me at thecritiquemd.com on the web, thecritiquemd. And you can also email me at Christine, CHRISTINE, at thecritiquemd.com. There is a Critique MD Facebook page. I'm trying to figure out a private group, but we'll start there.
Okay,
Email
great.
and thecritiquemd.com.
Perfect. Thank you. And everyone who comes into the cabin, we leave with at least one book recommendation from that friend who has visited. And I wonder today if you have any great book recommendations for us.
Yes. And luckily Allison gave me a little hint that this was happening so I could practice. One, just in context of what we're talking about today, there's a wonderful Harvard Business Review article called The Feedback Fallacy. I'm going to refer to it in some upcoming posts, but it'll just give you some interesting ideas on you giving feedback and receiving feedback. There is, in context of receiving feedback, and this notion of maintaining your power, there's actually a book called Claim Your Power by Mast and Kipp. It's a 40-day program that you can do exercises and go through. There's another great book who I am forgetting the name of the author right now, but it's called Power versus Force. It's a wonderful book, and we'll figure out the author's name. And then from a fiction perspective, just anything that Elizabeth Acevedo has written, her most recent one with The Fire on High, wonderful, wonderful. And in middle grade, The Truth is Told by Mason Buttle. By
Leslie Connor.
Thank you, Allison.
Absolutely. Christine, it has been a pleasure today to have you in the cabin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And as I always end with this, woohoo! And go be brave. Get your work critiqued and be awesome.
Wonderful. That's it today from Into the Words, a podcast from the Highlights Foundation.